Your uncle was a fool, and you're about to be one too.
Martin Hale's voice sliced through the county office. For a second, the copy machine's hum was the only sound left. Ruth went still by the door. Caleb Mercer stared at the contract in front of him. $25,000, enough to save the truck, cover the rent, and get Ghost the treatment he needed. Martin slid the pen closer.
Pride won't pay your bills, Mr. Mercer.
That's when Ghost stood up and stepped between Caleb and the table. Martin's smile cracked. Caleb reached into Elias's old folder and laid the survey on the table. The room changed. Martin Hale thought he was buying a desperate man's burden, but he had just pushed Caleb toward the one place ClearRock never wanted him to see. But to understand why Caleb walked away from the money, you have to go back to the day a rusted key, a dying town, and one stubborn dog led him to Mercer's Hollow. The sky over Boise had the color of wet ash that afternoon, low and tired, pressing down on the city. Snow from the night before had softened into gray slush along the curb, gathering in the tire tracks outside the brick law office on West Bannock Street. Caleb Mercer sat behind the wheel of his old Ford pickup with the engine off, both hands resting on the steering wheel, though there was nowhere left to drive just yet. The truck smelled like cold coffee, motor oil, worn leather, and dog fur. On the cracked dashboard sat three things he had been trying not to look at: a bitter cup of coffee, a folded veterinary estimate with $4,000 circled in blue ink, and a brown inheritance envelope with his name typed across the front. In the passenger seat, Ghost lay with his head lifted just enough to watch him, the faded service vest loose across his shoulders. He was getting older, not old exactly, but old enough for silver to show around his muzzle and for every movement to seem chosen. Caleb looked at the envelope again. A man could serve his country, come home standing, learn to fix pumps, generators, busted fence motors, dead compressors, and still find himself sitting in a borrowed kind of silence outside a lawyer's office, wondering whether $8,000 was a blessing or a trap. 20 minutes earlier, a lawyer named Daniel Reeves had sat across from him behind a walnut desk, polished so well Caleb could see the pale shape of his own face in it. "Mr. Mercer," he had said, sliding the envelope forward, "I need you to understand this before you get your hopes up. This is not a fortune. It's 7 acres of rock, a collapsing cabin, and a cave the county considers practically worthless." Practically worthless. The words had not offended Caleb on behalf of the land. He had never seen the land. He did not know Sage Hollow, Nevada, except as a dot on an old map, and the place where his father's uncle, Elias Mercer, had chosen to disappear into dust and stubbornness. No, the word caught because it sounded familiar. Worthless was a word people did not always say out loud, but Caleb had heard it anyway. He had heard it in the pause after someone asked what he did now, in the too bright smile after "Thank you for your service," and in the way customers stopped calling when the bigger companies came through with glossy trucks. A man could become useful in one world and misplaced in another. Reeves had given him the key then, a small rusted thing sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve, along with a folded survey map, creased so deeply it seemed to remember every hand that had given up on it. 7 acres, 1 cabin, 1 dry well, 1 natural cave listed in the county records as Mercer's Hollow. Then came the second sheet of paper. ClearRock Holdings, cash offer, $8,000. All transfer fees covered. Closing within 7 business days. Caleb had stared at that number longer than he meant to. It was not a miracle. It would not rebuild his life, but it was oxygen. It could keep the truck from being taken, put something toward rent, and get Ghost the treatment doctor. Harlan said should not wait much longer. It could buy Caleb a few months without waking up braced for the next phone call. Reeves had uncapped a pen and set it gently beside the document. Not pushing, not exactly, but close enough. A property like that can become a burden fast, he said. Taxes, liability, maintenance. Sometimes the cleanest inheritance is the one you don't keep. Caleb had almost laughed at that. Clean was not a word life had offered him often. He picked up the pen. His fingers knew how to hold tools, wires, wrenches, things with weight and purpose. A pen felt too small to decide this much. Beside him, Ghost rose from the floor where he had been lying quietly. Caleb remembered the soft scrape of nails against polished wood. Before the pen touched paper, the dog stepped forward and placed one paw directly on the purchase agreement. Not hard, not dramatic, just enough. Reeves blinked. Caleb froze. Ghost did not bark. He did not growl. He simply looked at Caleb, calm and unblinking, as if waiting for him to hear the question himself. Caleb lowered the pen. "Ghost," he murmured, but the dog did not move. Now, sitting in the truck with the gray city pressing against the windshield, Caleb pulled the key from the envelope and turned it in his palm. Rust flaked against his skin. A worthless cave. A dead uncle. A company eager to pay cash for land no one wanted. The heater ticked as it cooled. Somewhere down the street, tires hissed through slush. Caleb looked at the ClearRock offer again, then at Ghost, who had not taken his eyes off the envelope. For the first time all day, Caleb felt something other than exhaustion move inside him. Not hope. Hope was too dangerous. This was smaller, sharper, a question. He whispered it into the cab like a thing that might vanish if spoken too loudly. If it's worthless, why do they want it so badly? Caleb Mercer had always trusted broken machines more than quiet people. A generator would cough, sputter, spit smoke, and tell you exactly where it hurt if you listened long enough. A water pump would groan before it failed. A loose belt would whine. A clogged line would shudder under pressure. Machines had a language, and Caleb had spent most of his life learning it. People were harder. People smiled with tired eyes. People said they were fine, while their hands trembled around a coffee cup. People thanked you for your service in grocery store aisles, then looked away too quickly, relieved the sentence was over. Caleb was 41, a former Army combat engineer technician, though he rarely said the whole title out loud. In the service, his job had been simple in the way hard things are simple. Fix the generator before the cold settled in. Restore the water pump before the tanks ran dry. Clear the road. Reinforce the temporary bridge. Keep the lights on, keep the route open. Make sure somebody else had a way through and a way back. Back then, his hands were always busy, and his mind had somewhere to go. Men called his name because something needed doing. Caleb understood that. Need was clean. Need did not pretend. But Boise was different. Boise was quiet in a way that got under his skin. He rented a small house behind an old tire shop on the edge of town, where the gravel driveway flooded when the snow melted, and the porch sagged like it was tired of standing. Every morning, he woke at 4:30 without an alarm. He checked the front door, then the back door, then the kitchen window that had never once been open. After that, he made black coffee and sat outside with Ghost until the first pale light touched the rooftops. Ghost simply settled beside the chair, steady and watchful, while the street slowly came awake. Caleb worked repairing pumps, generators, irrigation motors, and old ranch equipment for small farms outside Boise. For a while, that had been enough. Not comfortable, but enough. Then the calls slowed. One ranch sold to developers. Another signed with a larger service company. A third owner apologized and said repairs would have to wait until the bank stopped breathing down his neck. In 6 months, Caleb lost 3 long-term accounts. He told everyone he was fine. He told his landlord the rent was coming. He told the finance company there must have been a mistake about the truck. He told Dr. Harlan he would schedule Ghost's treatment soon. The letters told a different story. The repossession notice sat in the kitchen drawer. The rent was 2 months late. Ghost's veterinary estimate had been folded and unfolded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. Caleb kept saying he just needed one good week. One good call, one job big enough to turn the air back into air. Ghost did not believe him. The dog had a way of noticing when Caleb disappeared without leaving the room. At night, when Caleb woke with his breath caught high in his chest, Ghost climbed onto the bed and laid his head across Caleb's ribs until the breathing slowed. When Caleb stood too long at the back door, staring into the dark behind the tire shop, Ghost moved between him and the glass, not blocking him, just reminding him that he was not alone in the room. Once, after a customer canceled a job Caleb had already bought parts for, Caleb sat at the kitchen table until the coffee turned cold. Ghost brought him an old work glove and dropped it at his feet. Caleb stared at it, then gave a small laugh that almost broke on the way out. "You think I forgot what hands are for?" Ghost wagged his tail once, as if once was enough. That was the thing about Ghost. He never asked what happened. He never asked why some sounds made Caleb's shoulders tighten. He never offered advice. He stayed. And on the hardest nights, Caleb would rest one hand on the dog's neck and whisper, "You don't ask me to explain. That's why I trust you." Ghost would close his eyes under Caleb's hand. Calm as a prayer Caleb no longer knew how to say. Elias Mercer was the kind of name people in Caleb's family said with a sigh already attached to it. Not anger exactly, not grief either, more like resignation. The way a person might talk about an old truck that never started when you needed it, but somehow refused to die. Elias had been Caleb's father's uncle, though that branch of the family tree had always looked dry from a distance. He lived in Sage Hollow, Nevada, a place Caleb knew only from a few faded photographs and one weather-beaten postcard. The family said Elias chose rocks over people. They said he had bought 7 acres of useless land outside an old mining town and spent decades guarding a cave nobody wanted. He did not come to weddings. He did not call on Thanksgiving. When someone in the family got sick, Elias might mail a short note weeks late, with no apology and no explanation. To Caleb's mother, that made him cold. To Caleb's father, it made him stubborn. To the cousins, he was just strange old Elias, the man who lived in the desert with dust in his boots and secrets in his pockets. Caleb had met him only 3 times that he could remember. Once at a funeral, where Elias stood near the back of the church in a faded denim jacket, hat held against his chest, saying almost nothing. Once at Caleb's grandfather's house, where Elias fixed a broken porch light without being asked, then left before supper. And once when Caleb was 19, home on leave, still too young to understand that some men carried silence, not because they had nothing inside them, but because everything inside had become too heavy to lift into words. What Caleb remembered most were Elias's hands, broad, rough, darkened around the nails. Hands that had known stone, oil, and desert heat. Caleb also remembered the way Elias looked at a person before answering, not in a rude way, but as if he believed every unnecessary word stole room from the truth. That made people uncomfortable. People liked noise. Elias did not provide it. Years later, when Caleb was still serving overseas, a postcard arrived with no letter folded inside, no greeting beyond his name. The front showed a narrow canyon in Nevada, stone walls lit orange by late sun on the back. Elias had written one sentence: "A man is not finished just because the world no longer knows where to place him." Caleb had read it in the dim light of a temporary barracks twice, then a third time. He had not known what to do with it. At the time he was still needed, still useful, still wearing a uniform that told the world where he belonged. So he tucked the postcard into a metal box with spare patches, old photographs, and a pocket knife his father had given him. He meant to write back. He never did. 3 years before the day, Caleb sat in Daniel Reeves's office. Elias Mercer died alone in Sage Hollow. That was the way the family told it, at least. Alone, as if it were both fact and punishment. There had been no dramatic scene, no final speech, no gathering around a bed. Just a notice, a short call, and the slow machinery of county paperwork. The inheritance had been delayed because of old boundary records, missing survey stamps, and some dispute between Elias's property line and public land beyond the ridge. By the time the legal dust settled, most people had forgotten there was anything to settle. Then Caleb's name surfaced as the only living heir willing, or unlucky enough to receive what was left: 7 acres of rock, a cabin that might not survive another winter, a dry well, a trail behind the house, a natural cave listed as Mercer's Hollow. Daniel Reeves had read those items with the careful tone of a man describing something that had already disappointed several people before reaching the current room. "Your uncle refused to sell that land for years," the lawyer said, tapping one finger against the file. "Nobody knew why. He had offers, small ones mostly, but he turned them down." Caleb remembered staring at the rusted key in the plastic sleeve. It looked too small to belong to anything important, too ordinary to carry the weight Reeves seemed determined not to give it. "Maybe he just didn't like being told what to do," Caleb said. Reeves gave a polite smile. "From what I understand, that may be accurate." But on the drive back to the truck, the old postcard returned to Caleb's mind with uncomfortable clarity. A man is not finished just because the world no longer knows where to place him. At 19, Caleb had thought it sounded like desert wisdom from a lonely old man. At 41, with bills waiting at home and Ghost's medical estimate folded soft in his jacket pocket, the sentence felt less like advice and more like a warning sent years too early. Maybe Elias had been stubborn. Maybe he had wasted his life guarding a useless stretch of land and a cave full of dust. Maybe some men simply did not know when to let go. Caleb turned the key over in his palm and watched rust stain the crease of his skin. The thought came quietly, and because it came quietly, it felt true. Maybe Elias had only been holding on to something useless because he recognized himself in it. And maybe that was why Caleb had not thrown the key away. Later, almost as an afterthought, Daniel Reeves had mentioned something Caleb could not stop thinking about. ClearRock Holdings had not made the offer once. That would have been easy to ignore. One clean sheet of corporate paper tucked into the back of Elias Mercer's file. Just another company hoping to buy cheap land from an unsettled estate. But there had been 3 offers. He had explained it with the mild discomfort of a lawyer who knew a detail mattered but had not yet decided why. The first offer came through Elias's attorney 6 weeks after his death, before the ground on his grave had settled, and before most of the family had finished arguing over who should clear out the cabin. That offer had sat inside the estate file for years while the boundary dispute froze everything else in place. The second came through the county office, while the boundary records were still under review, as if ClearRock had been watching the paperwork move from desk to desk. The third arrived 2 days after Caleb was officially named the legal heir. 2 days, Caleb kept coming back to that. Not a month. Not after an inspection. Not after anyone from ClearRock had asked about access roads, tax liens, or the condition of the cabin. Just 2 days, and there it was, printed in clean black letters on heavy paper that did not look like it belonged anywhere near Sage Hollow. $8,000 cash, all transfer fees covered, closing within 7 business days, no request to walk the property, no survey contingency. No argument about the collapsing cabin or the dry well or the cave the county had labeled practically worthless. They wanted it fast, quiet, and complete. That bothered Caleb more than he wanted to admit. In the Army, urgency had its own smell. Sometimes it smelled like necessity. Sometimes it smelled like fear. And sometimes it smelled like someone trying to move you before you had time to think. Caleb had learned to distrust men who hurried him with soft voices. But suspicion did not pay rent. Suspicion did not keep the finance company from towing his truck in the dark. Suspicion did not make Ghost's treatment any cheaper. By the time Caleb got home from Reeves's office, the sky had turned a bruised purple over Boise, and the tire shop out front had shut off its neon sign except for the letter T, which flickered alone in the window like a tired warning. He unlocked the back door, let Ghost in first, and stood in the kitchen without turning on the light. The house was cold in the way small rentals get cold. Not from weather alone, but from corners no one has the money to fix. He set the ClearRock offer on the table. Then he laid the veterinary estimate beside it. Then the repossession notice. Then he opened the drawer and took out the rent envelope he had not been able to fill. 4 pieces of paper. That was all. A man could build a whole cage out of less. Ghost circled the table once and lowered himself to the floor, nose near the rusted key. Caleb pulled out a chair but did not sit. He stood over the papers, rubbing one hand across the back of his neck. $8,000. It was not enough to save him, but it was enough to stop the bleeding for a while. That was the cruel part. Big money makes a man suspicious. Small money, offered at the right moment, can feel like mercy. He could pay enough rent to keep the landlord patient. He could make a truck payment and maybe silence the calls for a month. He could schedule Ghost's treatment without hearing doctor. Harlan's careful pause on the other end of the line. He could buy groceries without counting every item twice. All he had to do was sign away a place he had never seen, left by a man he barely knew, in a town that had no reason to welcome him. "It's just rock," Caleb said into the dim kitchen. His voice sounded flat, almost reasonable. "Just a cave. Just another thing I can't afford to keep." Ghost lifted his head. The dog did not come to him, did not press close, did not offer the usual comfort. He simply stared at the key, ears angled forward, body still as if listening through the floorboards. Caleb looked at him and felt irritation rise, then fade before it found a place to land. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered. Ghost blinked once. Outside, a car passed slowly through the alley, its headlights sliding across the wall and over the 4 papers on the table. For one moment, the ClearRock letters shone brighter than the rest, clean and white and ready to solve the wrong problem. Caleb sat down at last. He picked up the offer, read it again. 7 business days, all fees covered, no inspection required. He turned the rusted key over in his palm until one rough edge bit gently into his skin. Worthless land did not draw 3 offers. Worthless caves did not make corporations patient for years and impatient overnight. And dead men, Caleb thought, did not hold on to nothing, unless nothing had once meant something. He did not sleep much. Near dawn, with the kitchen window turning gray and Ghost still lying beside the table, Caleb picked up his phone and called Daniel Reeves. The lawyer answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with mourning. "Mr. Mercer?" Caleb looked at the key, then at the dog, then at the papers, waiting like a verdict. "I'm not calling to sell," he said. "I need directions to Sage Hollow." Caleb and Ghost left Boise before sunrise, heading south beneath a sky that slowly changed from black to bruised blue to the pale, washed-out color of old bone. The highway stretched ahead in long, empty miles, bending through open land where fences ran beside the road until they faded into the distance. Idaho fell away behind them. The towns grew smaller. Gas stations appeared like last chances and vanished in the rearview mirror. In front of one, a faded American flag snapped in a hard wind. Its edges frayed, its colors thinned by sun and weather, but still holding on. Caleb noticed things like that, things that stayed up because no one had taken them down. Ghost slept for the first 100 miles, then lifted his head whenever the road changed texture or the truck slowed near a town. Caleb drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the rusted key in the cup holder. Every so often, he looked at it and felt the same question turn over inside him. If it's worthless, why do they want it so badly? By afternoon, the land had opened into Nevada, dry and wide and almost biblical in its silence. Sagebrush spread in gray-green patches over the flats. The wind carried dust instead of snow. Caleb had seen lonely places before, but Sage Hollow felt like a town that had learned to live with being left alone. It was an old mining town that had outlived its reason for being and kept breathing anyway. A few wooden houses stood far apart, sun-bleached and stubborn. A hardware store had plywood over one window. The post office looked no bigger than a roadside chapel. Near the center of town, an old sign swung above a narrow storefront. Mabel's Range Cafe. It was the only place with cars outside and light in the windows. Caleb parked beside a mud-splattered ranch truck and sat for a moment without moving. Ghost looked at him. "Just coffee," Caleb said, as if the dog had asked. Inside, the cafe smelled of black coffee, grilled meat, old wood, and stories nobody had decided whether to bury or repeat. A bell above the door gave a tired little ring when Caleb stepped in. Conversation softened but did not stop. A woman behind the counter looked up from wiping mugs. She was in her 60s, maybe older, with silver hair tied low at the back of her neck and eyes sharp enough to cut through politeness. "Sit anywhere," she said. Caleb took a booth near the window. Ghost settled beneath the table with a sigh that made one man at the counter glance over and nod. Not quite a greeting, not quite approval. The woman came with coffee before Caleb asked. "Her name tag," said Ruth. "Passing through?" she asked. Caleb wrapped his hands around the mug. "Maybe. I'm looking for Mercer's place." Ruth's hand paused just slightly over the coffee pot. It was quick, but Caleb saw it. Men who had worked around dangerous equipment learned to notice the half-second before something changed. "You family?" she asked. "Elias Mercer was my father's uncle." At the end of the counter, a man with a red cap let out a dry sound through his nose. "Old Mercer and that cave," he said. "Whole place was useless. Should've sold it when he had the chance." Another man, heavier, with suspenders stretched over a plaid shirt, stirred his coffee without looking up. "That cave never gave anybody anything but dust." Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his jaw. There it was again. Useless, worthless, words people used when understanding took too much time. Ruth set the pot down harder than necessary. "That's because most folks only looked at the mouth of it." The counter went quiet in a different way then. Not hostile, remembering. Caleb looked at her. "You knew him?" Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, though they were already clean. Everybody knew Elias. Not everybody understood him. She glanced down at Ghost beneath the table, and something in her face softened. He had a way of sitting with people nobody else had patience for. Caleb waited. "What kind of people?" he asked. Ruth leaned one hip against the booth across from him. "Veterans, widowers, retired miners, folks who didn't fit anywhere cleanly anymore." The words landed too close. Caleb looked into his coffee, dark and unmoving. For a second he saw not the cup but his own kitchen table back in Boise. The 4 papers laid out like evidence, Ghost lying beside the key. "He ran some kind of shelter?" Caleb asked. Ruth shook her head. "No." Elias would have hated that word. Made it sound like he was above people, handing something down. He wasn't like that. She looked toward the window, where dust moved across the street in thin brown ribbons. He just made room, coffee, a chair, quiet if that was all a person could manage. Sometimes that's more than people think. The man in the red cap muttered, but softer now, still should have sold. Ruth ignored him, her eyes stayed on Caleb. Your uncle never treated quiet people like empty people. That was his gift. Caleb did not answer. Something in the sentence had touched him wrong, the way a doctor might press a bruise before asking if it hurt. Ghost shifted beneath the table and rested his chin on Caleb's boot. Outside, Sage Hollow sat under the wide Nevada sky, dry, stubborn, half-forgotten. It still did not look like a place that could change a man's life. But for the first time since leaving Boise, Caleb wondered if maybe that was the point. Some places, like some people, had learned to survive being misunderstood. Caleb reached the Mercer property just as the sun began to lower itself behind the broken ridge west of Sage Hollow. The dirt road narrowed during the last mile, fading from gravel to two pale tracks cut through sagebrush and hardpan. Dust rose behind the truck and hung there, slow and stubborn, as if even the air did not care enough to move on. Ghost sat upright in the passenger seat, watching through the windshield. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel and the other near the key in the cup holder. Though he had stopped touching it, he did not want to feel its rust anymore. He had spent the drive from Mabel's Range Cafe, trying not to expect anything, which was another way of expecting too much. Ruth's words had followed him out of town. He never treated quiet people like empty people. It was a fine sentence, maybe even a true one, but fine sentences did not patch roofs or pay taxes. They did not stop a cabin from falling in. When the property finally appeared, Caleb hated himself a little for the small lift he felt in his chest just before he saw it clearly. Then the lift collapsed. The cabin stood on a stretch of dry ground beneath a low wall of stone, leaning slightly to the left like an old man refusing help. The roof had sagged in two places. One window was cracked, another boarded with warped plywood. The porch steps looked soft with rot, and a loose strip of tin clattered above him in the wind. Near the side of the cabin, the well was nothing but a stone ring filled with dead leaves, sand and old cans bright with rust. Thorn bushes grew tight along the walls, their branches hooked into the siding, as if the land itself had decided to take the house back one splinter at a time. Behind the cabin, partly hidden by scrub and shadow, the mouth of the cave sat at the base of the rock face. It was covered by rotted boards and sheets of rusted metal that had been nailed up without beauty or welcome. Nothing about it looked mysterious. It looked abandoned. Worse than abandoned, it looked accurately described. Caleb stood in the yard until the cold began to work through his jacket. Ghost stepped down from the truck and sniffed the air, then turned his head toward the cave. Caleb noticed but said nothing. He was too busy feeling the old bitterness rise in him, slow and hot, not at ClearRock, not even at Elias, at himself, for driving all this way, for letting a dog's paw on a piece of paper become a sign, for thinking a dead man's silence might contain something better than one more burden. The cabin door stuck when he pushed it open, then gave way with a groan that seemed too human. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust lay thick on the floorboards. A small wooden table sat near the wall, one leg shimmed with folded cardboard. A chair with a broken rung leaned beside it, waiting for someone who had stopped arriving. On the wall hung an old calendar from the year Elias died, still turned to October. On a narrow shelf above the sink sat an enamel mug, upside down, its rim dark with dust. Caleb stared at that mug longer than made sense. It looked like a person had set it there before stepping outside for a minute, expecting to come back before the coffee cooled. But nobody had come back. The silence in the cabin was not peaceful. It was not the kind of silence men sought when they were tired of noise. It felt like a call that had gone unanswered for years. Caleb set his duffel near the door. Ghost walked the room once, quiet, then stopped near the back wall. Ears lifted toward the rear of the cabin. Caleb looked at him and felt irritation sharpen again. "Don't start," he said. His voice sounded rough in the empty room. He dragged the broken chair aside and sat on the floor with his back against the wall. The boards were cold through his jeans. He pulled the ClearRock offer from his jacket and unfolded it across his knee. The paper looked obscene in that place, clean and smooth and certain. $8,000. At first, back in Boise, it had sounded too small. Now, surrounded by rot, dust, and another man's unfinished life, it sounded almost kind. $8,000 is starting to sound like mercy, Caleb said. Ghost lowered himself beside him, but did not rest his head on Caleb's leg. Instead, the dog kept watching the back door. Caleb closed his eyes. He had wanted, secretly and foolishly, for one thing in his life to arrive whole. Not another broken thing asking more from his hands. But this place was another broken thing, and Caleb was so tired of being chosen only by what needed fixing. Night settled fast over Sage Hollow. The wind slipped through gaps in the boards and moved around the cabin in thin, searching breaths. Caleb spread his sleeping bag on the floor and lay down in his coat. Ghost stayed awake longer than usual. Just as Caleb began to drift, the dog stood, no growl. He walked to the back door, stopped, and listened. Caleb opened his eyes. "What is it?" Ghost did not move. Caleb held his breath and listened too. At first, there was nothing. Only wind worrying the tin. Only old wood settling. Only the empty voice of a worthless place. Or so Caleb told himself, because believing that was easier than hoping again. Morning came without warmth. It slipped gray and thin through the cracked cabin window, laying a weak strip of light across the floorboards and the ClearRock offer still folded beside Caleb's pack. For a while he lay there without moving, listening to the wind scrape softly along the walls. The place looked no better by daylight. If anything, the sun was less merciful than darkness. It showed every stain, every split board, every place where time had come in through the roof and made itself comfortable. Caleb sat up slowly, his back stiff from the floor, and rubbed both hands over his face. Ghost was already awake near the back door, sitting tall, eyes fixed toward the slope behind the cabin. Caleb followed his gaze and saw nothing through the grimy pane but brush, stone, and the ugly patch of boards covering the cave mouth. "You're not letting this go, are you?" he said. Ghost did not look away. Caleb folded his sleeping bag with more force than necessary. He packed the coffee tin, the flashlight, the clean shirt he had never changed into. He set the rusted key on the table beside the enamel mug and looked around one last time. The cabin gave nothing back, no hidden warmth, no final sign, just dust, rot, and the tired smell of old wood. Caleb picked up the ClearRock offer and slid it into his jacket pocket. "Come on," he said. "We're done here." Ghost stood, but he did not move toward the truck. Instead, he went out through the back door the moment Caleb opened it, down the two warped steps, across the hard dirt, straight to the mess of metal and boards at the base of the rock wall. By the time Caleb followed, the dog had his nose against the lowest plank, dust already clinging to his muzzle. One paw rested on the wood with the quiet certainty of a hand placed on a Bible. Caleb felt irritation rise, sharpened by hunger, bad sleep, and the shame of almost hoping again. "There's nothing in there," he said. The words came out louder than he meant. Ghost turned his head and looked at him. Not pleading, not excited, just steady. Caleb hated that look sometimes. It asked more of him than anger did. With a curse under his breath, he grabbed the edge of the nearest board and pulled. The wood resisted, then cracked loose in a shower of dust. Another board came free. Then a sheet of rusted tin. Beneath it, Caleb stopped. What he had taken for a careless pile of junk was not careless at all. Behind the covering was a low wooden door set into the stone, weathered and scarred, but built with intention. Someone had hidden it well enough for strangers to miss, but not well enough for the right person to lose. An old lock hung from an iron hasp. Caleb reached into his pocket for the key, then remembered he had left it on the table. For one absurd second, he nearly laughed. All night he had wanted a reason to leave, and now he had to walk back into the cabin to retrieve the very thing he had tried to abandon. When he returned, Ghost had not moved. Caleb slid the rusted key into the lock. It resisted at first rough metal arguing with rough metal. Then, with a small turn and a dry click, it opened. The sound was so soft it should not have mattered. It did. Caleb pulled the door outward. Cold air breathed from the cave and touched his face. Not dead air, not the stale, chalky smell he expected from a sealed hole in desert stone. This air carried dampness, mineral, earth, a clean, hidden cold that made the hairs on his arms rise beneath his jacket. He stood still, one hand on the door, suddenly aware of his own breathing. Ghost stepped past him into the dark. "Of course you're going first," Caleb muttered, though his voice had lost its irritation. He took the flashlight from his belt and clicked it on. The beam cut through dust and shadow, revealing rough stone walls marked with old white paint. 3 short lines, an arrow. Another mark farther in. Wooden steps had been fixed into the uneven floor, worn but still solid. A dead electrical wire ran along the wall, secured with rusted clips. Deeper inside, the beam found a metal shelving unit, a work table, plastic storage bins sealed tight, and a folding chair placed as if someone had once sat there often, facing the dark not with fear but with patience. This was not a forgotten cave. This was a place someone had used and protected. Caleb swallowed. The question from Boise came back, no longer sharp but widening inside him. If it's worthless, why do they want it so badly? Ghost moved ahead slowly, his nails clicking once against stone, then stopped near a bend in the passage. He lowered his head, listened. Caleb followed, boots careful on the old steps. At first he heard only his own breath and the soft brush of his jacket against rock. Then beneath that something else, small, steady, almost too delicate to trust. Drip, drip, drip. Caleb raised the flashlight. The passage opened just enough for the sound to gather. Somewhere beyond the bend, water was moving through stone. Not rushing, not announcing itself, just continuing, patient as a heartbeat. In a town that called the land dead, in a cave they called worthless, something was still alive. The first storage bin opened with a rubbery sigh, its seal breaking after years of being left alone in the dark. Caleb knelt on the stone floor, flashlight balanced against a rock, while Ghost stood close enough that his breath warmed the back of Caleb's hand. For a foolish second, Caleb expected something out of an old story, coins, jewelry, some hidden fortune that could make the last few years look temporary. But Elias Mercer had not hidden gold in the cave. He had hidden paper, maps, mostly, folded maps, county survey copies, contour lines, circled and dated in Elias's blocky handwriting. Caleb opened the second bin and found laboratory reports sealed in plastic sleeves. Water quality analysis, flow estimates, mineral composition, dates going back more than a decade. The third bin held notebooks, their covers worn soft at the corners. The fourth held folders stamped with the name ClearRock Holdings. On the top folder, Elias had written in pencil, "The public lie is in the county file." The private truth was harder to get. Caleb sat back on his heels and stared at all of it. No treasure glittered. Nothing shone except the flashlight on plastic and paper. But his chest tightened with the slow understanding that this was the kind of treasure men lied about. because it could not be worn on a finger or locked in. A safe. The sound of water continued beyond the bend, small and steady, like the cave was clearing its throat after years of being ignored. Caleb lifted one report and read slowly, lips moving over the technical phrases. Subsurface water access, naturally filtered through limestone and basalt layers. Stable flow. Low contamination. Recommended for further hydrological study. He read it twice before the meaning settled. There was water under Mercer's Hollow, not runoff. A clean, steady underground vein moving beneath land the county had called low use and practically worthless. In Sage Hollow, where wells were failing one by one and dust sat in the corners of people's mouths, water was not just valuable. Water was future. Caleb opened the ClearRock folder next. At first, the documents looked ordinary. Letters, survey requests, corporate stationery, property acquisition notes. Then he found a copied page from a private survey, the top corner bent and stained, with Elias's pencil marks in the margin and one phrase underlined in red: high-value subsurface water access. Caleb stared at it until the words seemed to darken. In another letter, the same land had been described to the county as non-productive acreage with limited practical use. Caleb let the page fall into his lap. He understood then, not in a flash, but with the tired clarity of a man recognizing a familiar kind of lie. They had called it worthless so no one would look closer. They had called it rock so no one would ask about water. Then they waited for Elias to die, for the paperwork to tangle, and for some broke heir to sign without stepping inside the cave. His hand tightened around the edge of the report. Ghost nudged his shoulder. Not comforting exactly, more like bringing him back before anger carried him too far ahead of the truth. Caleb drew a breath and reached for the notebooks. The first page of the oldest one held only 3 words, written in Elias's careful hand: the listening room. Caleb frowned. At first, he thought it was a name for the cave, some private old man poetry scratched into a notebook. But as he turned the pages, a different picture began to form. Elias had not simply guarded the cave, he had used it, carefully, quietly. He had repaired the cabin roof section by section, run a narrow pipe from the spring-fed flow into a holding tank, set chairs in the cool part of the cave, where the sound of water softened the silence, kept coffee, blankets, canned soup, and clean towels. Not enough to look like a program, too much to be an accident. There were names in the margins, but never full stories. Tom R., retired miner, sat 2 hours, said nothing, came back Thursday. Miriam L. brought peach preserves, cried when leaving, asked if silence counted as prayer. Frank D., veteran, fixed south fence, slept 6 hours for first time in months. No speeches, no diagnoses, no pity dressed up as kindness. Just records of presence. Small repairs, weather, coffee, whether someone ate, whether someone returned. Caleb read until the cave seemed less like stone around him, and more like a room full of chairs, still holding the shape of people who had once needed somewhere to sit. Elias had made no sign for it in town, no flyers, no name on a grant application. He had simply kept a place where people could be quiet without being mistaken for empty. Near the middle of one notebook, Caleb found a sentence underlined twice. A person can be wounded without being worthless. Never confuse silence with emptiness. The words landed with such precision that Caleb looked away. For a long moment, he listened to the water moving in the dark. He thought of Ruth's cafe, of men at the counter calling the cave useless, of the ClearRock letter clean and white on his kitchen table, of himself saying, "It's just rock, just a cave, just another thing I can't afford to keep." Ghost lowered himself beside him. Caleb rested one hand on the dog's back without looking down. The sentence in the notebook blurred at the edges. Elias had not been writing only about miners, widowers, veterans, or people. Sage Hollow had stopped knowing what to do with. He had been writing about every quiet thing the world misread. Maybe even this cave, maybe even Caleb. The last bin sat farther back on the shelf, half hidden behind a coil of old extension cord and a folded wool blanket gone stiff with dust. Caleb almost missed it. Ghost did not. The dog lifted his head, sniffed once, and looked toward the shelf with the quiet insistence Caleb had come to recognize as instruction rather than curiosity. Caleb reached behind the blanket and dragged the bin forward. It was smaller than the others, sealed tighter, its lid taped twice around the edges. For a moment he did not open it. The cave had already given him too much: maps, water reports. ClearRock's lie laid bare in black ink. Elias's notebooks full of quiet acts of care. There was a limit, Caleb thought, to how much truth a person could receive before it began rearranging the furniture inside him. Still, he cut the tape with his pocket knife and lifted the lid. Inside was a single envelope wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve. His name was written across the front. Not Mr. Mercer, not to my heir, just Caleb. Beneath it, in Elias's blunt, careful handwriting, were the words, "For Caleb, when you are ready to be angry at me." Caleb let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He carried the envelope to the metal chair near the bend in the cave and sat down slowly. Ghost lowered himself at his feet. Somewhere behind the rock, water moved with that same patient sound, not rushing, not pleading, simply continuing. Caleb opened the letter. It did not begin with sweetness. That almost made it harder. "Caleb, I was never good at staying close to people. I mistook silence for strength for most of my life." Caleb read the line twice. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though the cave was not cold enough to explain it. Elias wrote the way he had spoken, plain, spare, unwilling to decorate what hurt. He admitted he had missed too much: birthdays, funerals, Thanksgiving tables where an empty chair had become easier to explain than his presence. He wrote that he had known when Caleb came home from the service. He had even driven once as far as Boise, parked across from the tire shop, and watched Caleb load a broken ranch pump into his truck in the rain. "You look tired," Elias wrote, "but not finished. I should have crossed the street." "I did not. That failure belongs to me." Caleb stopped there. The cave seemed to grow smaller around him. He pictured Elias sitting in an old truck across the street, close enough to call his name, far enough to remain a ghost. Anger rose in Caleb, but it was not clean anger. It carried grief inside it, and recognition, and a strange ache for a man who had been present in the wrong direction. The letter continued. Elias wrote that he had wanted to call many times, but fear had made a coward of his good intentions. He feared sounding like pity. He feared asking questions Caleb could not answer. He feared offering help in a way that made a grown man feel handled instead of seen. "If there is one thing I learned sitting in this cave with men who had been asked to explain themselves too often," Elias wrote, "it is that a man trying to stand does not need another person describing the shape of his fall." Caleb pressed his thumb against the edge of the page. Ghost shifted and rested his chin on Caleb's boot. Then came the sentence Caleb was not ready for, though it had waited years for him anyway. "I did not leave you this land because I thought you needed saving. I left it because I believed you would understand what it means to protect something other people call worthless." The words entered him quietly, and because they entered quietly, they went deep. Caleb had been given sympathy before, polite concern, advice from people who wanted his pain to become something neat and finished. This was different. Elias was not calling him broken. Elias was handing him responsibility, not as punishment, as trust. The letter explained ClearRock in plain terms. They had come first with smiles, then with paperwork, then with better offers. When Elias refused, they waited for age, confusion in the records, and death to do what money could not. "They will come to you kindly," Elias wrote. That is how people buy what they do not want to be seen taking. Caleb looked up from the letter toward the bins of reports and maps. He could almost see the design of it now, elegant and cold. Call the land non-productive. Call the cave useless. Wait for the heir to need money. Offer just enough mercy to make the truth feel expensive. But Elias did not command him. That was what undid Caleb most. "If you sell it, I will not curse you," the letter said. "A hungry man should never be shamed for choosing bread. But before you decide, stand in the cave. Listen to the water. Then ask yourself whether everything valuable in this world comes with a price tag." Caleb lowered the letter to his lap. He did not cry, not yet. He sat so still that even ghosts seemed to hold his breath. Years pressed against him from all sides, the unpaid bills, the canceled jobs, the truck notice, the long nights when he had felt like a tool left out in the rain. He lifted the page again. The final paragraph waited there, simple and merciless in its kindness. "If the world has made you feel like a used-up tool, come here, sit by the water. Remember this: a tool is only useless in the hands of someone who no longer knows what it was made for." That was the sentence that broke him. Not loudly. Caleb did not fold over or make a sound. His face only changed the way land changes when the first rain touches dust. He had spent years believing usefulness was something others assigned to him. The army, customers, landlords, people with forms, invoices, contracts, polite voices. But Elias, from a cave in a dying town, had reached across time and handed him a different measure. Caleb was not a problem to solve, not an object to pity, not a thing whose worth had expired. He was still someone who could protect what others overlooked. Ghost stood and placed his head on Caleb's knee. This time, Caleb did not swallow the grief back down. The tears came hot and quiet, falling onto the letter, blurring the ink at the edge, but not enough to erase it. He rested one hand on Ghost's head and listened to the water moving inside the stone. Elias had not left him a cave. He had left him a question, a trust, a place where a man could begin again without asking the world for permission. Caleb returned to Sage Hollow with dust on his boots, Elias's letter folded inside his jacket, and the ClearRock folder riding on the passenger seat beside Ghost. He had slept only a few hours, but the exhaustion in him had changed shape. It was no longer the dull, sinking kind that made every decision feel like surrender. This was the tiredness of a man who had found work waiting for him and understood, with quiet dread and quiet gratitude, that it was his. The county office sat beside the post office in a low beige building with a flag out front and two dying shrubs by the door. Inside, the lights hummed overhead. A clerk with reading glasses led Caleb to a small meeting room, where a man in a navy overcoat was already standing beside the table. "Mr. Mercer," the man said, extending a hand. "Martin Hale, ClearRock Holdings." He was about 50, clean-shaven, polished, his voice warm. Nothing in him looked cruel, and that was what made him hard to trust. Martin Hale did not look like a man who took things. He looked like a man who helped people let go. They sat across from each other at a table scarred by years of public meetings. Ghost settled near Caleb's chair, calm but awake. Martin opened a slim leather folder and smiled as if they were discussing a used tractor. Not a dead man's land, and the water moving underneath it. "I understand you had a chance to see the property," he said. "Rough shape, I'm afraid." Caleb said nothing. Martin nodded with professional sympathy. Properties like that become expensive quickly. Liability, access issues, maintenance. Most people don't realize what they've inherited until it starts costing them. The words were smooth, too smooth. Caleb had heard the same kind of voice from men who said they were only trying to make things easier while quietly deciding what your burden was worth to them. Martin slid a paper across the table. ClearRock is prepared to revise the offer. $25,000, cash, fees covered. We can close by Friday. For a moment, Caleb did not move. $25,000 changed the air in the room. $8,000 had been oxygen. $25,000 was a door. It could pay the rent, save the truck, cover Ghost's treatment, and buy Caleb the right to walk away. Martin saw the silence and leaned into it gently. Mr. Mercer, this is more than generous for land the county has already classified as low use. Caleb looked down at Ghost. The dog's eyes were on him, steady as they had been in Reeves's office, steady as they had been at the cave door. Caleb reached into his folder and placed the water analysis on the table. Then he placed the copied ClearRock survey beside it. The phrase high-value subsurface water access faced upward, underlined in red by some hand that had never expected Caleb Mercer to read it. Martin's smile thinned, but it did not vanish. Men like him trained their faces for inconvenient truths. Caleb tapped the survey once. You didn't want the cave, he said. You wanted what was running under it. The room went quiet, except for the fluorescent hum above them. Martin folded his hands. Subsurface rights can be complicated. So can lying, Caleb said, not loudly. Martin's gaze shifted to the documents, then back to Caleb. I would be careful with accusations. Caleb almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because Elias had been right. They came kindly until kindness stopped working. My uncle was right, Caleb said. Some people call a thing worthless because they're hoping nobody looks closer. Martin did not answer. There was nothing useful left for him to say. Caleb stood, gathered the papers, and tucked them under his arm. His legs felt steadier than he expected. The land isn't for sale. He left before Martin could turn silence into another offer. Ruth was waiting outside the county office with 2 coffees, and the expression of a woman who had already guessed the ending, but wanted to hear it anyway. Caleb took 1 cup. I'm going to need help, he said. Ruth smiled, small and real. Good. That means you're thinking clearly. Help came slowly at first, the way water finds a path through stone. Ruth knew a retired attorney in Carson City who cared more about old promises than billable hours. The county clerk knew where Elias had filed public access notes that no one had bothered to read. A former miner named Walt showed up with a toolbox and fixed the cabin door without asking for permission. A veteran from 2 towns over heard about the place and brought spare lumber. Caleb began the long work of protecting the water source for local community use. With a retired attorney, a hydrologist from Reno, and more county forms than he had patience for, it took weeks, then months, and even then, they were not solving everything at once. They were simply keeping ClearRock from quietly closing the door. There were forms, inspections, delays, and costs that kept him awake. But the phone started ringing for repair work again, too. Word got around that Elias Mercer's nephew could fix a pump and keep quiet when a man needed silence. Caleb patched the roof, reinforced the porch, cleared the old well, and cleaned the cave entrance. Then he carried the chairs back into the cool bend, where the water could be heard but not seen. When Ghost's treatment was finally scheduled, paid partly from 3 repair jobs Ruth had quietly sent his way, and partly through Dr. Harlan's monthly plan, Ruth drove them there and pretended not to notice Caleb's hands shaking in the waiting room. Spring arrived shyly in Sage Hollow. One morning, Caleb hung a wooden sign beside the cabin door. He had sanded it himself, burned the letters by hand. The listening room. No one has to earn their dignity here. The first people who came did not come in crowds. Ruth brought bread wrapped in a towel. Walt repaired a hinge and stayed for coffee. An older veteran sat in the cave for an hour without speaking, then nodded once before leaving. A man who had lost his job helped Caleb prime the pump and returned the next day with work gloves. No one was asked to tell their story. No one was rushed toward healing. Caleb made coffee, fixed broken things, walked the trail with Ghost, sat beside people when silence was all they had to offer. On a clear morning months later, Caleb stood at the mouth of Mercer's Hollow while sunlight warmed the porch behind him. Ghost lay near the door, eyes half closed, muzzle silvered by age and light. Inside the cave, water moved through stone with the same patient sound it had made long before ClearRock. Before Elias, before Caleb had needed a reason to stay, it did not announce itself. It did not ask to be praised. It had been valuable long before anyone learned how to say it. Caleb once thought an inheritance was what the dead left behind. Now he understood it was also what the living chose not to betray. They had called it a worthless cave. But Caleb finally understood. The cave had never been empty. It had only been waiting for someone who knew how to listen. If this story stayed with you, tell us which moment hit you the hardest and where you're watching from. And if you believe in loyalty, second chances, and finding your way back, make sure to like and subscribe.